That's Power, and it's being done by Southern. I played trumpet for 6 years, and that music always amps me up. Thank you, Frank, for facilitating that as a background. So I'm super excited to talk to you guys today. Me and Frank have a lot of conversations. I usually call him around like maybe 7 a.m. right after the gym. He's been in the gym as well, and we're kind of pushing forward. And we have many conversations about life, transparency, privilege, challenges, and I've told Frank a lot of the stories of my life and heard a lot of the stories of his, and I hope that this will be an experience where I can talk to you guys about storytelling, owning your story, knowing who you are, and give you some background. So first, if I could give you one gift, it would be the gift of perspective, right? So the way we see ourselves, the way we see what we do, many people, I thought about titling this How to Ride a Dragon, a Practical Guide, because I think we as entrepreneurs need to know our stories and not be ashamed of them. I think one of the big parts for me is I didn't have an option. I'm maybe different in the room, and you'll see I've raised venture in the past, but there are not many folks who necessarily look like me who've raised venture. And so for me to be in a position where I can just own my story and not have it represented, and I think everybody out here, if you're truly yourself and you truly have your story, you might not find that your story matches a pattern. Like, we might not all get the VC, riding the dragon experience. We might not all have huge, massive exits. We might not all have the things that TechCrunch tells us we should, but we do have our own stories, and we should be really powerful about that. And so I think the first place in terms of perspective is to remember at any given time that we are spiraling through space on a thing that has been kept in the same location by a star, right? Like, the sun is just the closest star to us, and we're doing trips around the sun, right? So this is my 30th trip around the sun. I'm 30 now. I have 2 kids. I've got a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I'm having a new baby in 30 days. So 3 of these guys, right? And they're my people garden. My wife is really the real hero of my story. She is the one who facilitates to actually allow this life to happen. We met in Taiwan, and from Taiwan to all over the world, she has been the bedrock. And I think acknowledging the people who are in your story is really important. And so back to this, I think just remembering that this is unique. There may be other life out there, but we don't really know about it. So buckle up, guys. We're on Earth together, right? Remember, and it's okay to stop and just think more broadly, not just think about the city, not just think about your startup, not just think about what's happening, what is the darkest thing that's happening when you look at your bank account and it's negative, or you look at your bank account and it's there. You gotta find mechanisms to get perspective. And so I think my wife is kind of the 3rd generation of really strong women who have made me into who I am. And if I go back, the 1st generation is actually my grandmother. So I always start all my VC pitches with this story, and so I'm going to share it with you guys. And it's a story that many of them may have not heard before. So my mother grew up in Louisiana in a place called Ruston, which is a really small town, and she was the first black woman to integrate into schools in this part of Louisiana. Now, my mom is fairly light-skinned, and so when she went to the white school in her community, or what was once a white school, they didn't recognize her until one day they were looking at her hair, and they're like, I'm not sure if you fit. And as soon as they did that, they did the original late Graham, showed up at my grandparents' house, and they burned her cross in the front yard. Okay, and she didn't stop going. She didn't care. My grandmother was the first black woman to vote. She passed a voter rights test in Louisiana in her parish, and that has driven me really hard. So when my parents moved from Louisiana to Houston, I grew up in a mainly black community. I'd say probably about 95% black, the other 5% Hispanic. Hispanic is, that part of the community has grown a ton. And I went to school in Fort Bend. And Fort Bend is actually the most diverse county in the country. And so I think it was like kids from about 200 different countries as first generation immigrants were there. And so I lived this life, one life at home where in my church where I was fully in the black community, and another life where I was in a huge multicultural community, and I was always looking for intersections between the two. I was looking to see where that worked. And so now I run Group Raise, which is a marketplace. And the reason I think I am, my core identity as a marketplace entrepreneur is from that experience. And I didn't even know growing up that looking for those intersections would make me who I am. And so that is the story that I start all of my pitches for Group Raise with. Right? And it took me a long time to have the courage to tell that story because I'd never heard anyone tell a story like it. And when I tell you that story, I don't tell it to you to cause you to think that oh man, that's just his unique story. I think every one of you will have a unique story as to how you've gotten your perspective. What were the things that you saw? What were the things that made you into who you are? And I think it's a really, really rich thing to do, to process and access that part of your story. And it won't be my story, but it'll be yours. And I want to really, really encourage you to think about that. So Group Raise. We like to think of Group Raise as the most delicious way to change the world. But what we're doing underneath that is we're connecting charitable organizers, so moms, sorority girls, cancer survivors, people like that, with local restaurants to host large group events, so typically between 20 and 200 people. And the restaurants for that size donate a percentage of the sales back to a charitable cause, and people have a really fun social time. We also do networking events and kind of company events and things like that as well. You come to something like this where you're just with a big group of people, you have fun, you eat, you talk, and at the end of the night, the restaurant donates a percentage of the sales back to a charitable cause. It's really super simple, and it's powerful. And we've been able to take that simple concept that started in Houston, and I'll skip forward. And now we're in over 150 cities with 9,000 restaurant partners. It's been a super humbling journey. We started in 2011. And so for all of those who started the day with their stories of like authentic journeys, of long journeys, that the pattern is not necessarily 3 to 5 years and you have these huge exit outcomes, that's a story that you shouldn't be ashamed of, and that's a story that you can be a part of. That still means that you can be building something meaningful. And so we had multiple phases in the business where we couldn't raise money for stretches and years of time, and phases in the business where we could. And so we went through Techstars, which was a huge transformative experience for me. In 2015 is when we started, and we graduated in 2016. And Techstars Ventures later became one of the first VCs to back the business. Magma Partners, which is actually a VC that we met in South America through Startup Chile, is how we went down originally, and then we were connected with a venture partner there, and they made investment, and then K4 Capital, which is based in the Valley, who they're really passionate about helping diverse communities be successful, and Mitch Kapoor is an awesome visionary who has done a lot of stuff. And I always like to say, like, the last time that Techstars and K4 invested together was in Uber. And so, that's in the trajectory backstory, but we, instead of having the same kind of maybe toxic culture that they're known for, are diverse and have a different background. So I hope that we can build a huge new narrative that people can look to recognize that you don't have to match these other types of narratives. And so this was our story. Our story was this actually in July 2015 is when we learned how to really sell to restaurants. And it kind of has a couple of months there, but really the long tail was 3 years. It was like 3 years to get to 500 restaurants. And then we learned how to fundamentally change that. And then probably in another talk, I would tell you how. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But this has been a framework that has been really, really, really useful for me. And I think as going on to thinking about how do I tell a story, how do I build things of value, I think one of the most raw, basic resources of value is generated in pain, right? So, and I think there are many types of pain, but the pain you experience as an entrepreneur is a really amazing resource that other people don't have access to, and actually other people want, if you like reframe it, that will give you the opportunity to drive progress. So this is a Ray Dalio quote, which is pain plus reflection is equal to progress. And really the concept here is going through something that you just really wish you didn't make that decision, or there's just like some really hard challenge. If you take the time to reflect on that, it will derive a set of lessons that you can take and help you get to progress. And so for me personally, I think I've always said that my goal professionally is to build a system as complex and as beautiful as a tree. And so, which I never heard anyone have a goal like that. So I just was like, well, I'll have my own goal and set, because I think whoever thought of a tree, it's like a freaking amazing idea. Like they breathe out what we breathe in and vice versa. And they're like perfectly aesthetic. And like they're an ecosystem and things live in them. And so that's my career aspiration. And so for me, when I think about that, that my personal experience was like I went through a bunch of pain. I try to spend time with founders to share that pain candidly and clearly with them. And that through that mentorship experience, that helps me distill why I wouldn't make that decision again or why I would make that decision again. And then I get frameworks, right? And so I'm hoping that you guys will walk away today with some frameworks that are derived from the pain of this experience for you to have more options. So I was just actually having a conversation in the room about the nature of privilege. And I think of privilege purely as a tool, right? So how many in this room woke up this morning and got a glass of water? How many people, right? Now, how many of you had to spend money to get that glass, or not even spend money, had to walk more than an hour to get that water, right? None of us, right? So that's not to make anybody feel guilty. That's just to acknowledge that privilege was a tool that allowed us to not have to think about that problem, right? And so as we look at higher and higher stratospheres in society, right, or higher in the definition of how people might think of like financial resources higher, and we look and say that there's privilege there, oftentimes I think we have to reframe our thinking to realize that it's a tool. It's something that we want to expand. I actually want to see everyone in the world. For me, it's one of my deepest passions to see everybody on the planet have access to clean water in less than a minute, right? But in doing that, I wouldn't want anyone in this room to not have the privilege that they have, right? And so I think as we have this conversation about being not as represented in historical circles, as we have these conversations about how do we grow inside of communities, I think it's important to realize that it's not necessarily the goal is to destroy the tools that have been used to create social progress, but to expand access to those tools. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the frameworks that for me were given to me. I didn't create. Some of them were maybe distillations that I observed, but things that were given to me that really have helped me have access to things that other people who had the tool of privilege in the past had. And it is my passion to give that to you guys. And so one of the first and most important frameworks that I've experienced is do not negotiate against yourself, okay? So when I say this, right, it is this concept of that many of us are building and trying to become what others of us have told us we're supposed to be, right? So versus who we actually authentically want to become. What do we want to be? What do we want to do? And I think any time in your life where you believe that you don't have an option, you don't think that you could do something a different way, there's no way that success could be defined in this way. There's no way things can work out. That's a sign of negotiation against yourself, right? And oftentimes we don't We don't talk to someone who we really wish we had a connection to because we assume that they wouldn't like us, or we're afraid to put out this deck or tell the truth in this way or to have this vulnerability because we're scared of rejection. And I think one of the statements I'm always talking to between my wife and I is like, only take the scar once, right? So we beat ourselves up. We are the ones who oftentimes beat us. And so there's a story I'm going to tell you to illustrate this. And it was actually written by a guy named Norm. I'm going to say Bromsky, but he's not. He's like a lesser Norm Bromsky than the philosopher. And he essentially sits down with a business owner who is really, really behind in his bills to the bank, right? And he's stressed out, and he thinks that the bank is going to be really angry at him, and he's kind of built this mental model for how that's going to work. And so he goes to him and he says, I'm going to go to the bank and I'm going to offer them 20% of my revenue so that I can get good with them and go forward. And he says, do not do that. Don't do that. And he tells them a story, and he actually, Norm owned a file storage business, right? And so this file storage business moved documents for law firms, moves documents in kind of these physical spaces. And his biggest customer was a single law firm. And this law firm, the guy who ran it, was actually a really great dude, great business person, and would give this brutal feedback to Norm about kind of papers being late, but was always really kind to his employees and staff. And he told them kind of at the end of this year, if you haven't improved, we'll take our business somewhere else. And so Norm took it on himself to do the best he could to make sure that they served this client really well. And so what actually ends up happening is that everything's going great, the contract's doing well, and just the morning before he's going to go and renegotiate the contract, he gets a phone call. And this phone call is from one of his employees who says, hey, it was raining and I was moving some documents, and they fell. And they fell in between the truck and the warehouse. And they fell in this huge puddle of water. We opened it, and it was mainly handwritten docs. And he was like, oh no, who was it for? And it was for this law firm that he was just going to go and negotiate their contract with. And in his mind, he was like, oh, crap, like this guy's going to ream me. I'm going to lose this contract. I'm going to lose my business. And like, I don't even want to go and take that. And so in his mind, he was like, oh, I can't even go to this meeting. Like, I already know what the result's going to be, so I might as well not go. But he's sitting there, and he's like, you know what? I want to have the dignity and courage to be the one who tells him what happened and just take it. And so he decides to go to the meeting. And when he goes to the meeting, he walks in the door, and the guy is sitting there, and to his surprise, he's smiling. He's like really happy. And he's like, oh, it's kind of interesting. And he's like, hey, I wanted to say that I've been really impressed by all the improvements you've made this year. And it's been a really great year. And like, we're really excited to sign this contract. Do you have the contract? And it dawns on Norm that like, he actually probably doesn't know, right? And he's like, oh crap, like I could just take this signed contract, but then he'll be pissed off. He's like, but no, that would be wrong. So I'm gonna tell him. And he's like, okay, I see that you're ready to sign the contract, and that's great, but actually, I don't know if you heard about this, but this morning we lost a substantial number of your documents, and they were mainly handwritten, and they fell in this puddle. And the guy looks at him and he says, well, yeah, I totally heard about that. It was actually one of my core partners who I've hated, and I fired him, and I thought it was hilarious. And he signs the contract, and Norm walks out. And he has this like realization that like he was going to not go to a meeting because he assumed that he knew the outcome, that if he knew that he was just going to go get reamed, and he would have actually probably lost the deal simply in not going. And this goes back to the guy who goes to the bank, and instead his posture when he walks into the bank is he tells him the situation and asks the banker what we could do. And the banker makes this amazing deal where he actually forgives a lot of the debt and just requires a lower monthly payment, right? And so I think one of the things that we need to do as founders as we tell our stories is oftentimes to allow the situations we face to dictate what happens versus us just assuming the worst will happen in our experience. Like, don't go through this process and negotiate against yourself. And inside of Group Raise, I've had many opportunities where I've been very scared to either tell the truth, I've been really scared to continue forward, to take a meeting, when in reality, I've learned that I'm actually a really bad predictor of the future, and it's just much better to let what happens happen once than to let that eat me up inside and not go as hard as I possibly can. And so, there you go. And in this process, I think one of the core frameworks to think about, and I think I've maybe counseled some of the entrepreneurs in the room, but I talk about this a lot, is to always think about the difference between the road and the wall, okay? So if you've decided that you're in the right business and that you know at this point in time what you need to do is sell customers, but your bank account is low, if you go and stare at your bank account, it will make you so sad, okay? Like, it is looking into the void of sadness, right? And so you need to identify inside of your business at any given point in time, when people talk about focus, right? You need to understand what you need to focus on, so what you need to look at versus what you need to not look at. And if I can give you any advice, it is really important that all the challenges that you face in your startup, you either put on the road, something that like needs to be solved and is solvable and you can move forward, or the wall, right? And the wall is things that just are, that when you look at them, they make you sad. They take you out of that. And there's a difference between not being honest with yourself, because I think you have to have self-honesty and understand. And so there's always a time to kind of know where the wall is and identify what's on it. But when you drive, and in my experience, running a company is like a lot like driving, you have to look at the road, and if you look at the road, the car will follow the road. If you look at the wall, you will hit it. You will definitely hit it. And this comes inside of a framework of how they teach race car drivers to drive, right? They're like, when you're driving 200 miles an hour, coming and taking a hard turn, where you look is where the car will go. And so your most precious commodity is your focus. It is what you choose to look at. It is where you choose to see, right? And sometimes things on the road are going to be really hard problems, things that need to be solved, things that don't look good. This is not about just telling you to look at things that look good, but don't look at things that are neutral and don't matter. How are we doing on time, guys? 2 minutes. There we go. Sweet. Yeah, so this is like, I think going at this for 7 years, you will see many walls, like walls all around you, you know? And it's oftentimes an order of operations problem. And one of the biggest dichotomies in this is, and this is why I think if you have a co-founder, it's really amazing, because sometimes your wall is someone else's road, right, and vice versa. And so if you have a co-founder, I think being really transparent about where's your wall and where's their road is really important. But if you don't have a co-founder or you're just getting started, this is where other founders come in handy, right? You can talk about the road and the wall with other founders. Like, build these great relationships. I think when Frank started this conversation, is that, like, ideally this is a community where we help each other. I think these are the kind of conversations that can be really helpful, is to just sit down and to like share your pain in the right place, okay? You know, it's like when you're dating and you have a best friend, like, you don't have the same conversation you have with your best friend about the date as the person on the date, okay? This is really important and basic, okay? And oftentimes I will see people have conversation with investors, like talking about the wall, talking about their sadness, you know, like, I'm feeling so lonely. Like, who goes on a date and is like, hey, all my relationships in the past have failed and I'm alone, right? That's technically subtextually true, right? But it's like not really what we're leading with, right? And so it's not that you shouldn't have those conversations. And I think a lot of people tell you to bottle that stuff up and don't talk about it. But get a best friend, okay? And that's what we have to do for each other, right, in this community, is to be the best friend, right? So that you can have the delineation of when you're talking and focusing on the road, and have the delineation when you're talking and focusing on the wall, and don't just let it spill out randomly on anybody, right? Because that is one of the challenges when we talk about how do you scale and how do you move, is like your employees, you don't want to, like, you're going to get really sad. You're going to have really hard times. And blowing up on your employees is not going to make it better. It's not a good place for that, right? You know, it's like if you don't have a therapist, get a therapist, okay? It's okay. We struggle with mental health. We'll talk about that later, right? You know, like, find good outlets to talk about the road with, to talk about the wall with, that are not outcome oriented, so that when you need to talk about the road, which is getting your employees excited and exhilarated, talking to your investors, that you can be authentic and talk about what's the big problems that you're focusing on, and then find other ways to process this. And I found this to be an unimaginably helpful framework to think about what are the communities who's my best friend, right? And then who am I on a date with? Right, and think about that differently. And I don't think there's anything wrong, and you're not being unauthentic if you tell your story in that way. And so I think that's all the time we have, or we're coming to it. So now, this was kind of billed as cold email and talks and all this stuff. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we grew the business in this last minute. And the biggest thing is that in terms of building relationships and communicating with customers, is that context matters, right? Which goes back to when I talk about the road versus the wall, is knowing the relationship you have with people, right? And building a relationship in a context-rich environment. So I now send a lot of email, right? But every email I send, I imagine that I am one block away and we are talking one-on-one, and I only will communicate with you if I can have a high fidelity conversation. And I think a lot about the data that goes into that in order to do that. And so I think that oftentimes we talk about scale and we talk about like individual relationships, and we imagine that those things fight against each other. And in my experience, they don't. The question is like whether you can go through the abstraction process of building that. And so one of the really great books I recommend, just in terms of thinking about how to create scale and communication, is this book called Made to Stick. And if you're really wondering about how to get marketing traction, I think this is a really, really great way to do it. So that is the conversation that I've wanted to candidly have with you, founder to founder. If you're ever interested in talking about the wall, right, I'm completely available and would love to do it with you so that you don't spill it out on people randomly in the street. So there you go.